And there are a few other shots in the film that are on a tripod, like the interviews are shot on a tripod. I have a panning shot in the film. And then when Paul here was cutting through ice with a chainsaw, that was like that was the thing I was most excited about filming, especially because I'm shooting it in 60 frames per second, and I know I'm getting a lot of information, and I thought, like, spraying ice is going to look so cool. But my worry was that he would do it, like, once or something, and be like, well, that's it for the day, we cut all the ice. And I wanted to make sure I had plenty of B-roll. So I put the 42.5 millimeter on a tripod to shoot this. And then meanwhile, with my second body, I have the 12 millimeter lens, and I'm running up, getting a really close shot with ice spraying on the lens. And so that's one place where I might use a tripod, just so I can double up all my B-roll. But I show you the tripod shots and the jib shots just to say that the majority of the shots in the film are handheld. That's how I like to shoot. I like to move quickly, get a lot of shots very quickly. And so the in-body image stabilization helps me out there. And one of my favorite shots in the film is this shot that's clearly a handheld shot. At the beginning, you could see a little bit of movement. But once I decide to settle down and just put the camera against my body, it really stabilizes. And the second half of the shot, you can't tell that it's not a tripod shot. So that's what the image stabilizer is doing for me. It still looks handheld when I'm moving around. It's not like it turns everything into a gimbal shot. But when I decide to settle down, it takes away that jitter and it makes it look very usable. And this is straight out of the camera. I really like I'll show you the image profiles here on this camera. So like I like to shoot with the natural color profile, but there are several options you can choose from. A lot of people like Cine like D and Cine like V. They added a like 709 color profile in this camera, so if you want to shoot in a 709 color space, you can. But I like natural. It's the way I've been shooting since the GH3, shot that way in the GH4, and that's a shot like this is natural, and I didn't do any color correction to it. So you're at a broadcasting show, there's tons of great cameras here, and I think we get so hung up on which camera to use. I think we have to remember that cameras are just tools, and you have to find the camera that fits your shooting style the best. I personally have liked the GH line for a long time, mostly just because I think it's informed the way that I shoot. I like to be very lightweight, and I think I've benefited from having a small camera. And one of the ways that I've really enjoyed using these cameras is I do a lot of like red carpet events. When I was in news, I would do the Golden Globes and the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And they always put everyone in the little press area. You're stuck over there. And I just wasn't getting the shots that I liked over there. So what I would do is, I'm wearing a tuxedo, so I would just take my camera. Maybe if I had like a microphone on top, I might remove that, because everyone knows you're a videographer when you have a microphone. You take the microphone off, now I just look like any old person shooting photographs, and I just wander onto the red carpet with my camera, my little camera, and no one stops me. Security, if I have a big shoulder rig or a big shoulder camera, they're going to kick me off, definitely. I'm not supposed to be there. But when I just walk on with this, I'm able to get the shots I want, and no one knows that I'm a professional, that I'm getting 4K video. So a lot of filmmakers spend a lot of time trying to turn their DSLRs into a really professional, credible-looking thing. You put it on rails, you put a microphone on top. I actually do the opposite. I'm not always trying to look like a professional. I want to look a little bit less obtrusive. And I'm able to get some interesting access with a small camera. Another thing that I really like about having a small camera is one of my favorite pieces of filmmaking technology is this thing called the Pedco Ultra Clamp. It's just a little clamp with a ball head on top. And I've been using these for years. I think we had these when I shot Sriracha, right? Did I have this? And now I could turn anything into a tripod. Here's like a light stand, and I've just connected to it. I sometimes put 2 cameras on one tripod. I often travel with one tripod, but might have to shoot a 2-camera interview. So I'll put the tripod pointing at the talent, and I'll just find like a chair or something. I can find something to turn into a second mount for the camera. Here's an example of a ride in Las Vegas, a Ferris wheel, and they have a no tripod rule. You can't bring a tripod on this ride. So I just mounted it upside down, connected to the handrail, and I was able to get the time lapse of the whole thing moving around. So I'm always looking for ways to travel as light as possible, and having a small camera, having a couple of these ultra clamps, turns me into like a moving studio. This is an example of how I might use the clamp. Just clamp the camera to the bottom of a forklift and get a cool shot like that. This actually freaked me out a lot because this was still the pre-production GH5. I was one of the only people with this camera, and I was willing to be a little bit risky with it. But I just feel like if I'm not going to try to get the cool shots that I want, I don't know. I'm willing to take a little bit of risk with my camera and lenses. It did scare me, though. Because I don't think Panasonic would have given me another one if I rolled over it and crushed it with a forklift. Yeah, that was this. Which lens was that? That was probably the 12 millimeter. So the lens itself wasn't stabilized, but the body did that stabilization work. Yeah. And just locking it on does a lot too. The fact that it's locked onto the bottom of the forklift. I'm up at the top shooting that shot, and I'm going, whoa, because I'm on top of the forklift. But it helps to. That's why I like these things. You had a question? I did a little bit of warp stabilizer on it, but it looked pretty good out of the camera. Let's see. So let's see. I've talked about the lenses I use. Oh, I haven't talked about the lighting. For this film, I was shooting in pretty dark situations. I used my primes to get as much light as I could. But for like the interviews, I wanted to make sure that I was lighting a little bit. So I actually used this ice light that you see back behind Scott. Yeah, Scott's demonstrating it now. It looks like a lightsaber. I pulled that into the bars, and it has a little tripod mount on the bottom. So I used one of these ultra clamps. I can just mount the light, and I would just clamp the light to a shelf or something. I'm not bringing light stands with me. I'd find a place I could mount it to shoot the interviews. And then in a pinch, if I really need some light, I have this little lume cube, which is not the best quality of light. It's very blue and it's very hard, but sometimes I'll bounce it off a light, like a wall or something, or I'll put a diffuser on it. And this can be, in a pinch, a way to get some light. Another good use of the Pedco Ultra Clamp. I can just clamp a light on and put that wherever I need to. It also makes for a good backlight. So again, I'm looking for lightweight solutions, ways that I can bring a lot of tools with me on the road without having to bring a big Pelican case with me. I'm trying to avoid checking bags. And then, like I said, there were a few shots that used a jib in this film. I have the Pedco Ultra Clamp. And then normally I travel with a Manfrotto tripod. This is like my lightweight international travel tripod that I bring. It's a Mi Photo carbon fiber. Any questions about the gear that I use? And why I use it? So just to show you some of the various resolutions we can shoot with on this camera, it has a 20 megapixel sensor, so you can take photographs. And I do a lot of time lapses this way, shoot with the whole sensor. It's in 4:3. Later I can decide to crop it into 16:9. You can also check out, if you're interested in anamorphic lenses, we have an anamorphic lens on one of the GH5s back there. You can shoot in 4:3 in this camera with an anamorphic lens and squeeze it on. One of the cool things that's about to happen is Panasonic is planning to release a firmware upgrade for the GH5 that lets you shoot the full sensor, full resolution at 30 frames per second. So you can do anamorphic at a really high resolution, higher than you can shoot 4K right now. Or I also just think you could shoot 4:3 if you wanted, crop it later. There's some interesting possibilities there. But most of the stuff I'm shooting that's not a photograph, I'm shooting in 4K on this camera. And then not every video needs to be 4K. I still shoot 1080 all the time. I just shot my podcast like an hour ago right here, and that does not need to be 4K. It's just me talking. So I shot that in 1080. It'll be quicker to deal with. In fact, when I was working in news, anytime I was not editing my own stuff, usually other editors would be pretty mad at me when I gave them 4K footage, because they don't want to edit 4K when we're putting it on 1080 broadcast anyway. But 4K is 4 times bigger than 1080, and I do like shooting with it when possible. One of the reasons I like to shoot with it is mostly just because I can blow it up and it looks great. I also find that if you're new to 4K, even if you're editing in 1080, when I do side-by-side tests, shooting in 4K and editing in 1080 looks better than shooting in 1080 and editing in 1080. Just having that additional quality up front is better, if you can deal with it in the editing. The camera can do several frame rates. Of course, it can do 24 frames. It can do 25. It can do 30. Now that I'm working in television, I actually prefer to shoot 30 over 24, just because those extra 6 frames a second make a big difference in terms of judder and moving shots. In fact, a lot of people will get a new GH5 or something. Maybe it's their first 4K camera, or maybe it's the first time they're shooting 24 frames per second. And people send me this footage, and they're like, I shot this footage, and for some reason it's really jittery. And I'm like, well, I don't know, maybe you're new to 24 frames, but there's a pretty big gap in 24 frames. Like, it's not the camera, it's just 24 frames per second can look really jittery so don't move around like that. Try to shoot pretty stable. But you can also shoot 50 and 60. You can shoot 60 frames per second, up to 60 in 4K on this camera. And I actually shot this film in 60 and presented it in 60. So if you want to watch it on YouTube, you can see it in its full 60 frame per second glory. But even if you don't like the look of 60 at 100%, you can slow it down. So here's slowed down to 24 frames per second and still looks nice and smooth. Kind of looks like I'm making a commercial for this chainsaw company. Here's another 60 frame shot at 100% speed and then slowed down to 30 frames per second. This was in the Philippines. I was doing a workshop there. And the camera can also do 180 frames per second. So if you can't do that in 4K, but if you're willing to shoot in 1080, you can get up to 180 frames per second. That's called the variable frame rate mode on this camera. And here's an example of some 25 frame footage at normal speed, and then I switched the camera into 180 degree mode, or 180 frames per second mode, and it's crazy slow. In fact, you can see the light flickering in the background. It's shooting faster than the light refreshes. Here's another 180 shot. I always like pairing slow motion with the 7 to 14 millimeter. It's kind of a dark lens, and you're going to lose a little bit of light performance when you shoot high frame rates, but that just movement always looks so interesting on this really wide lens. Luckily, I was shooting with a decent amount of light on this stage.